This is the panel Environment in the History of West Africa, and we have four excellent presenters. We're going to go through the panel in the order you see them in your program. So we will start with Dr. Hassan Sarr, who is going to be presenting on agriculture, spirituality, and landscape changes in the Lower Gambia region from about the 1940s to 1996. Dr. Sarr, welcome back.
Thank you, Professor Aleji, and thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, and I want to begin by thanking Professor Achebe for inviting me to participate in this amazing conference with amazing group of people. Congratulations also for this milestone. And I look forward to attending the 20th anniversary when I will assure you that you will see more gray hair. So it's good to be here. In rural Gambia, where people believe in the existence of jinns and other spirits, the unseen supernatural world constituted an important element of people's world, informing every aspect of rural economic life, including farming. Here, many believe that the causes of illnesses were commonly connected to multidimensional beings, such as spirits. Thus, solutions to the problems of everyday life, example, social anxieties, insecurities, desire for a better livelihood, or access to more land were often sought by soliciting the help of gifted men and women. Among these were Muslim clerics who were perceived to have special powers that allowed them to operate between the spiritual and physical realms. They could prescribe remedies to address people's problems. That is, they healed the land as well as people. My paper makes three broad arguments that I think are interrelated. First is the argument that the belief in the presence of these spirits in the Lower Gambia impacted land use patterns and the environment. Jinns were believed to inhabit some of the thickest bushes and big trees in the vicinity of many of the area's villages. Rivers and swamps were also their favorite dwellings. People called them jinni. Traveling Commissioner H. Lloyd Price of the North Bank province of the Gambia wrote in 1907 that every village is supposed to have two of these, a bad spirit and a good spirit. In some cases, they say the village spirits, or jinni, are male and female, and the female ones are really very bad. You have to be very careful with them. Another spirit is the kondorong, which people believe is a mythical bearded dwarf with feet back to front, human-like genes that were very short and malevolent, and they live in the forest. The kondorongs would typically appear to a lone individual, mostly nomads or pastoralists who are wandering with their livestock in the bush or their farms, and ask them to wrestle. In case the kondorong throws the person to the ground during the wrestling, the latter would either die or get paralyzed. Another frightening spirit that people living in the area said inhabited the streams around the riverside villages of the part of the Lower Gambia called Nyomi, where I'm from, was the Ninkinanka. Gambians, Lady Soughton, who wrote in the early 20th century and was the wife of a senior colonial official, said, the people were dogged by fear of devils, and chief among these is the Ninkinanka code. Seen by a man, if seen by a man, is a sure sign of approaching death. Anthropologist David Gamble gathered a story of how 6 Jola women who saw a Ninkinanka around Bakau in what used to be the Cape St. Mary's region of the Gambia died. In the early 20th century, Lloyd Price also summarized the fear that local people had about the Ninkinanka. He said, a well-known Mandinko myth is the Ninkinanko, which is supposed to resemble a gigantic serpent which resides in the thickest bushes or rivers or hills or swamps. If a native sees the body of this creature, he believes that he will be afflicted with dangerous sickness, but if he sees the eyes or the crown, it means instantaneous death. All these spirits had their own favorite times of day, the time before dawn and dusk, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the hottest part of the day, and midnight. These were the most dangerous hours to be out and about, and these were the times that these spirits would like to wander. Villages that were unknowingly founded on spirit lands, I call them, often were abandoned because people were convinced that these spirits could destroy the people. Time after time, settlements mentioned by earlier writers that seem to have been of some importance in their day have vanished completely. Trade routes changed, towns and villages were destroyed due to acquiring a bad reputation for unhealthiness or the malign influence of spirits. Gamble, the anthropologist, again attributes this constant, I quote, waxing and waning and breaking up of the villages to such beliefs. The second argument that I want to put forward is that an examination of the link between agriculture and these kinds of supernatural beliefs in West African Muslim societies can reveal much about landscapes changes or alterations of the physical environment. Such spiritual beliefs about land and spirits might be considered an indigenous way of ecological preservation and protection, even if that may not be the conscious decisions that were guiding people's actions. Belief in spirit had important consequences for the environment as it prevented farmers from cutting down certain trees or from farming in some places or settling in other areas. What I saw in some of the sources that I have used is that with the growth of Islam, the intense Islamization of the Gambia River region from the mid-19th century onwards, increasingly more Muslim clerics who appeared in the region and convincing people that they have the power to deal with these spirits. With that, the more of these lands were cleared for cultivation or that they were inhabited by other places. I tackled this elsewhere in man. So as the Islamization of the region intensified, I argue, from the mid-19th century, many of these spirits were believed to have been defeated or converted into Islam, because the most dangerous of these spirits were not just the female ones, but also the non-Muslim ones, the kafirs, right? So a jinn could be either a Muslim or a non-Muslim, right? And what does that say about when a cleric says he has the power to convert a jinn into Islam? How much spiritual authority or religious authority would he be able to attract and mobilize a following? So the third interrelated point that I want to make is that, and this will deal mostly with the next section of what I'm going to do, talk about, that is one of these clerics that I study and talk about in my current work. I'm mostly interested in rural agricultural histories. That's that's one of the things that I've been working on, but also predominantly Fulbe speaking peoples. I think one of the misconceptions, for lack of a better word, that that you see in this West African historical scholarship is the overwhelming depiction of Fulbe people as a predominantly or primarily or exclusively a pastoralist or nomadic group of people. Very rarely do we characterize them as sedentary agricultural peoples who also grow crops and are tied to the land in significant ways. So the Fulbe are portrayed as entirely pastoralists, but many of them had been farmers as early as the late 18th century, as far as I can tell through the documentary record, right, or even before. When Mungo Park visited the region in the 1790s, he noted, quote, the industry of the fuller as the occupation of pasturage and agriculture. Park wrote that the greater part of the corn is raised by them, and he continued. So this brings me to this important late 19th, early 20th century figure called Cherno Muhammadu Baba Jallo, who was born in a small village, Fulbe village in what is now part of Saloum in northern Senegal. The village is called Sare Momat Nene. And he then was educated in the Upper Casamas, in what I call the Firdu country, the country where Dave also does most of his research. So he traveled throughout the region seeking education and so on. And he comes from a family of really important, clerics who were itinerant people that moved from place to place. But sometime around 1940, he went back to settle in the village that his father founded, which the British actually described in the 1932 report as one of the few villages with, quote, schools at which advanced Arabic was taught. So it was a center of Islamic learning and scholarship in the early 20th century. And as soon as he returned back from the Firdu country, few months later, his father passed. And so he was then appointed the Caliph of the village. But he's, they're Sufis, but followers of the Tijani order. In fact, his grandfather was said to have received the wird from Al-Haji Umar Tal. That's their claim, right? So, and he was the one that they say first introduced Sheikh Abdullah Niass to the Tijani Tariqa, and then many other scholars. In the Q&A, I can talk more about that. But what is really interesting about Cherno Muhammadu Jallo and his father and his grandfather was that they were tied to rural, isolated communities, and that they embraced farming and consciously rejected urban life. They wanted to be in the most isolated places where they could focus on agriculture and farming. And his actions, not only was he a great teacher and a spiritual guide, but he also led his community to the land, farming. And he experimented with a lot of things. Not only did he cultivate millet, rice, but also peanuts. And one of the things that he also did, which caught the attention of the British colonial administration in the North Bank province, was that he established a massive orchard in the late 1940s. And he got the seedlings and the nurseries from Freetown in Sierra Leone. And he had a student that he sent who actually traveled from the Gambia in a steamer and I looked this up, the steamer, British-owned, was called the Apapa, that connected, England with various West African cities. Weekly, monthly, this steamer would come through some of these ports and then linking the region to Europe. So he got these seedlings and then planted established this orchard, which people say was inspired by an action that he witnessed when a local trader had come to his village to sell mangoes, which were not, according to the people, not known in the area. And there was a row, a disagreement, because some woman had claimed that she had paid for the mangoes, but then the seller said, no, you didn't pay. So there was an argument. So when the Marabu came and witnessed that, he asked and decided to buy the remaining mangoes and give it to the woman. And then from that date, he said he's going to establish his own orchard so that his community will be self-sufficient. And he actually, once the orchard was established, he said it's not for commercial purposes. It's for the people. The poor people can harvest it. It's also to feed the animals in the forest that needs to be fed or taken care of, because he believed that will also give blessings. If those animals are fed just like people, that could be a way to get blessing. So one of the other things that he also did, for the interest of time, I would wrap up. Thank you. So he also helped people who claimed that they were afflicted by these spirits, and he also waged, according to him, and his people who praise his, who write his, or who talk about his record, claim that he drove some of these jinns or these spirits, or converted them into Islam, and by doing so, he made it possible for a lot of people to have land, particularly those immigrant groups that came into his community who needed land but previously could not have access to land. So anyway, I will stop there, but only to say that articulation of spiritual beliefs and exploitation of land through agriculture were closely linked in Medina Bafuloto, that is this village where this cleric live, and he guided his community to these local understandings, and which also had major implications for how they related to their land and ultimately, their own existence or survival. Thank you very much for your time.
My apologies to Hassan. I didn't give your title and affiliation at the beginning. Associate Professor of History at Ohio University, thank you. And Dr. Rebecca Wall is our next speaker, Assistant Professor of History at Loyola Marymount University. And the title of her presentation is Incorporating Climate Data and the Registers of Liberation.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to Dr. Achebe for the invitation to be here. It's truly an honor and a privilege to present at this conference, and thanks to everyone who worked on the planning for all the work that went into it. So my talk today will discuss opportunities to explore the connection between environmental history and histories of enslavement and liberation. Using a set of records from colonial Senegal, the Registers of Liberation, The registers have formed the basis for a digital history project I co-direct with Richard Roberts and Rachel Jean-Baptiste at Stanford and Babacar Fall at Université Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar. This project's called the Senegal Liberations Project. So in my presentation, I'm going to begin by providing brief background to the Senegal Liberations Project, or SLP, its historical context, and the attendant research and public history opportunities. One such opportunity is to incorporate environmental and climate data into analysis of the demographic information contained in the registers. I'll then discuss some of the historical climate data I've located so far, followed by a few brief examples of the kinds of analysis that are possible when looking at the SLP registers alongside environmental information. Finally, I'll point to next steps and future possibilities for this research. My hope is that by the end of my talk, you will be as excited as I am for the possibilities of what we can do for the historiography of both environment in the Western Sahel and historiographies of enslavement and liberation in West Africa. So without further ado, the period covered in these registers is 1856 to 1903. To set the stage for the remainder of this talk, let's travel to Senegal in the second half of the 19th century. French colonial control is nascent and superficial in most places, aside for a few coastal enclaves, like places notably like Saint Louis, Senegal. After 1856, France has passed legal abolition of slavery, but as voluminous scholarship shows, French anti-slavery sentiment was limited. And elsewhere in Senegal, outside of French-controlled zones, its colonial power was more hypothetical than real on the day-to-day, although it strengthens, let's say, in the period covered in the registers. In any case, the French were willing to overlook ongoing enslavement and other forms of unfreedom if it appeased local elites. This dynamic, where urban, largely coastal spaces, where the French role was more potent and where not always, but more often, anti-slavery was a legal reality, alongside interior spaces where enslavement remained tolerated and widespread, created a situation where enslaved people could heroically, I would say, self-liberate by going on their own locomotion to places like Saint Louis. And when they arrived, they would approach colonial officials and receive certificates of liberty, and their names and demographic information would be recorded on the registers of liberation. So the Senegal Liberations Project began in 2019 when I was a digital humanities fellow at Stanford. So Stanford, since the 90s, has had microfilm copies of these records. This is one page, but they're actually housed at the National Archives of Senegal in Dakar. So as I mentioned before, they date from 1856 to 1903, and they contain nearly 30,000 entries, where each entry is one individual who liberated him or herself. So there's interest in these sources for some time, but historians by and large haven't really picked them up. And so perhaps one reason for this is that the registers are, like all colonial sources, have profound limitations. And so while the number of people in the registers is quite, I think, significant, about 30,000 again, they go into very little detail for each individual person. And that's not to even get into issues with the accuracy bias of the entries. So for example, everyone on a roll might have the same age, or they might come from somewhere very vague, like the desert or Chez les Moors, which is kind of, maybe betraying like a lack of interest or knowledge about the specifics, right? At the same time, the registers have special potential to foreground the agency of enslaved West Africans who liberated themselves, right? So on the registers, each row is one person, and then each column is different demographic data. And so these are what the columns are. So the various columns, as I said, contain demographic information. So date of the liberation, their name, age, whoever recorded it, where they were born, if they traveled with anyone. Because they're in French, you can usually infer someone's sex as well. So this is precious information about thousands of people, but relatively minimal for any one person. So the thinking behind the SLP as a digital initiative is that it could follow in the footsteps of more advanced initiatives like slave voyages, liberated Africans, and many others. And that could maybe help overcome some of the, again, limitations of these colonial sources through public-facing digitized access. And with the ultimate goal being to foreground the agency of people who liberated themselves and enable new research from North America to Senegal and beyond using these registers, like the first panel discussed this morning. So the project recently received a 3-year collaborative research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I'm very excited that Michigan State's expertise, especially matrix, is going to be playing a big role in it going forward. So it's very special to present this project in this location. But in short, the SLP is a growing research initiative that presents many opportunities for new scholarship. I should also mention, as of today, we've nearly completed kind of data entry. We're preparing it, but we're, with this grant, going to be able to launch transnational research teams where about half of the scholars are based in Senegal and the rest in North America and Europe. And so I'll get back to this later, but I think having stakeholders based in the location concerned will be a big resource, and it's just important and ethical. So more on that later, but I want to get to climate and environment in the time I have left. So as an environmental historian of West Africa, I'm very excited about how we can use the registers and look at it alongside environmental data to understand not only the dynamics of liberation, but how environmental and social histories are linked. But a primary challenge for integrating environmental information with the registers is that, okay, we need to locate historical climate data. The kinds of information that we know exists and could be useful includes precipitation data, temperature data, indirect evidence of climate like river flow volumes. You know, there might be long-term records of this, but we could also maybe consider following what Richard Roberts calls in litigants and households trouble spots or moments of material or social tension like drought, famine, or flooding. Those tend to have more information readily available. Another kind of environmental data might not span decades, but could rather be intra-annual, so looking at seasonal variations. Locating and consolidating this information is a tall order. We know it exists in different forms because it was the kind of thing colonial officials cared about and wrote down. And oral history could provide profound insight that would really, really bolster this. And I'll circle back to that at the end. So in the National Archives of Senegal, numerous repertoires contain climate-related data. Likewise, in the National Archives of Mali, I found some. I won't get into it for time reasons, but oftentimes, a lot of this information is buried in the reports that local administrators sent from this like circular level, like upwards. So it's actually very, you really need to go through a lot of reports to reconstruct the data. Something that might be helpful is a department like Travaux Publics, but it's not really extant for the 19th century. So 20th century is a lot easier to find historical climate data in the colonial archive than the 19th, which makes sense given the relatively short history of the colonial state such as it was. You know, I won't speak about what could be found by expanding archival research to France or elsewhere in West Africa, but suffice it to say, there's a lot of information out there and available. But in practice, I don't know, I would kind of visualize myself as like this truffle hunting pig. Like, I don't know why I'm saying that, but sometimes I was like visualizing myself like hunting through all these archives. And that's like a very, very big material and temporal ask. But fortunately, other scholars going back for decades have conducted research on the historical climate of the Western Sahel. And there's exciting research more recently as well. These are just 2 monographs. There's also articles by people like Andrew Clark, older French works. Things are being published all the time. So I wanted to mention as well the references, charts, tables published in such sources by previous historical scholarship is a rich site for climate information. Can also look beyond history. I know it's just like, it's hard to turn like a data set into a compelling graphic for a PowerPoint, but beyond history, there's scholars like Sharon Nicholson, who's a historical meteorologist, have been particularly productive on reconstructing the historical climate of West Africa. So Nicholson and her co-authors in 2012 published a large public data set that presented, in their words, a semi-quantitative precipitation data for all of Africa in the 19th century. This is excellent, again, because there's less readily available climate information. for the 19th century than the 20th century in the Colonial Archive. So in their article, they develop what they call a wetness index, which just denotes by region whether or not there was greater or lesser precipitation than some type of baseline. The data set they built is 480 pages. This is like a snippet. So it's a big resource that can be mined for not only West Africa, but Africa as a whole. So in the last 5 minutes, I just want to really quickly kind of gesture to the kinds of analysis we could do right now without doing any new archival work. So the first example makes use of Nicholson and her co-authors' wetness index. It shows for a given region whether precipitation was more or less than average. So this is useful, I think, mostly for identifying the kind of trouble spots or moments of extremes more than kind of a long-term longitudinal correlation. So I've circled the relevant portion for the Senegal Liberation registers, but there's obvious limitations to this. Okay, so first, for example, if you look at the map, the region they call the Sahel is much larger than the most relevant geography for the SLP registers. I'm not a historical meteorologist, but I find it implausible that this index would be equally applicable for that entire geography. So it's quite crude. But that being, I shouldn't say it's crude. I could like never make that in a million years. That being said, I do think incorporating this semi-quantitative measure in tandem with further archival and especially oral research would yield helpful insights and results when looked at in tandem with enslaved people's self-liberation. And then as my final example, I'm very excited about the possibilities of looking within the year rather than across time. I like this. It's very appealing because it doesn't really require outside research, but rather relies on well-established seasonal variation in climate in the Western Sahel and how this impacts social and economic life. So in a 2021 article, we did a preliminary analysis for a limited number of years on liberations per month. So that's what this chart shows. There's more that you'd have to do to actually make this useful. I don't have a lot of time, but you'd want to think about when they left versus when someone was recorded in the registers. Also how, depending on someone's point of departure, something like the monsoon would begin in a different month. But nonetheless, without diving into all of that right now, this is just to show how we can use the registers of liberation to think about how enslaved people's decisions about when to self-liberate might be impacted by environmental or climate factors. So, to conclude, my presentation today introduced the Senegal Liberations Project and suggested that this emerging and growing digital project not only represents a contribution to public histories of enslavement and liberation, but also provides exciting avenues for new research into the environmental history of West Africa. I reviewed some possible sources of historical climate data and provided examples of the kind of analysis possible. Well, both because this is an emerging project and my presentation is only 15 minutes, and like being on the last panel, I don't want to test anyone's patience. This talk should really be seen as more of a first look at some of the possibilities and avenues we're pursuing than any kind of final word. So with that in mind, next steps include continuing to collect and build out climate data, especially for the 19th century, to the greatest degree possible and looking at it alongside the information in the registers of liberation. Earlier, I talked about how it might be difficult or laborious to consolidate information from reports buried across archives, but given the importance of this topic and the potential of the registers to be a source of social historical information, I think it's worth it. And it would be useful not only to people who want to interact with these sources, but who want to do West African environmental history generally. As that goes underway, and I think it would be something difficult to finish even in my lifetime, analysis can be expanded with an eye to an article-length paper for a journal like JWA, basically by taking extant climate information, like from Nicholson, like from other published materials, and lining it up alongside the information in the registers. And then I want to conclude by saying another very exciting but so far unexplored path would be to conduct oral histories, as these would bring forward environmental information that is not reliant on whatever random colonial officials thought was important, right? And for this reason, I'm so grateful that we have the support to have these international research teams, because this is something that is like a perfect, logical, next step. And I'm really excited to see what we would find. by talking to people in Senegal and Mali. So I could say a lot more. I'll end with that. But I do thank each and every one of you for your attendance today. I thank the organizers, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the papers on this panel.
Thank you for the presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Robin Davignon, Associate Professor of History at New York University, and the title of her presentation is Archiving the West African Underground.
Yes, thank you. I just want to echo what a huge privilege it is to be here today and to meet and also see many good friends in the room. I'm really honored to be here. What I'm going to be presenting today is kind of a montage of a couple ongoing collaborations I have, but primarily with Mohamed Diop, who is the head of Documentation et Information for Senegal's National Geological Service. So we're working on an archival, we're hoping to raise money to digitize an archive that is now in charge of. That will be sort of the focus of my talk today, and pulling out what I think some of the promise of archives like this and others might be for rethinking not just environmental histories in West Africa, but also cultural, economic, and religious histories of the region. So in a sandy corner of the Université de Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, sheltered by aging acacia trees, sits the annex of Senegal's National School of Mines. It is a compact concrete structure split into 2 floors with an open staircase attached to the rear of a 1954 modernist building that once housed the Federal Direction of Mines when Dakar was the capital of colonial French West Africa. The annex was designed to house hundreds of narrow metal cartons of soil and rock, so geological samples drawn from missions carried out by French and later African geologists in what are today the independent states of Senegal, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, and Mauritania. 70 years later, 3 Senegalese women in their 20s undertaking an internship for UCAD School of Library and Archives donned latex gloves and surgical masks to wade through a labyrinth of aging boxes and yellowed papers punctured with silverfish boreholes. They have been triaging several hundred yards of papers for a rapid inventory of what is likely West Africa's largest subterranean archive. So in January of 2024, just several months earlier, the janitorial team for the adjacent building moved these papers from their tomb since the early 1980s, a colonial-era scientific library that later became a storeroom for independent Senegal's Ministry of Mines. Generations of Senegalese earth scientists have referred to this sprawling collection of photographs, correspondence, and maps as La Bibliothèque, or the library. But the School of Mines requisitioned the physical space of the library to create much needed classroom space for its burgeoning student body. So the annex has become a transitory home for its sprawling collection of field notes, photographs, and most importantly, maps that span from the 1890s until the 1980s. So La Bibliothèque is representative of the types of institutional repositories that environmental historians are increasingly encountering as researchers take up topics related to the Earth's subsurface. There has been a recent explosion of scholarly interest in the subterranean, driven in large part by a growing awareness of the intersection of global mining industries, geological science, and the planetary crisis of climate change. If the subterranean was once the domain of scholars of mining, who foregrounded questions of labor, class, and capital, over the past few decades, anthropologists and geographers, namely, have forged a critical science and technology studies of the underground that interrogates the relationship between the production of subterranean knowledge and political power. So what might this mean for West African history? Historians and archaeologists have long shown how African societies manage 2-dimensional geographic space. So some prominent examples include road making by the Ashanti Kingdom and the organization of sacred space in the stone architecture of medieval Zimbabwe, to mention a couple examples. But by contrast, we have few accounts of how African polities, lineages, or individuals managed 3-dimensional resources. So we can think here not only of minerals, but also of aquifers, and perhaps in some specific settings, even airspace. So how have West African societies given political form to geological processes or to geological formations? This was a question I took up in my own book, A Ritual Geology, which told the history of one of the world's oldest indigenous gold mining economies, Francophone West Africa's orpaillage. So orpaillage is a term used since the late Atlantic period for gold mining and panning by African men and women, and it's a term that was later been appropriated and used to describe their labor and their organizations in the present day. So in the book, I introduced transnational geological bodies, specifically a type of gold-bearing rock formation known as Birimian rocks, as a framework for historical analysis of the West African past. So the diverse communities who mined gold over the past 2 millennia practiced ancestral religious traditions, Islam, and blended religious traditions. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, I argued there was a set of practices, prohibitions, and cosmological notions that were shared broadly by gold miners that worked across gold-bearing Birimian rocks. And I called this ritual geology. So in the case of orpaillage, this ritual geology had several components. Just to talk about a couple here before I pivot into other potential similar stories. One is that since the medieval period, there's evidence that orpaillage was predicated on a sacrificial exchange relationship between gold miners and territorial spirits. And these spirits often came in 2 classes. One were kind of more localized territorial spirits, and the others were spirited serpent snakes. So for those of you familiar with the history of Ouagadougou, the Soninke Empire, also sometimes glossed as Ghana, Bida is the kind of guardian snake of Ouagadougou that persists in many oral traditions from Soninke people, reverberating into even the present day. And Nininkala, or what is it in the Gambia? Not Ninkin, yeah, it has like 7 different names, is another snake often associated with the Mande world. And there's a lot of interpretations about what these snakes mean when they appear in oral traditions of land settlement, etc., which Professor Saar and others have analyzed. But it's interesting to note that they have very specific sort of movements across the landscape in oral traditions. Bida often goes in a north-south trajectory. Some surmise this could be trade routes. Others think that this also could have something to do with how people talk about looking for aquifers on the landscape, whereas Nininkala moves in an east-west direction, often aligning with the Gambia River and the Niger, where it bends. So I also argue in the book that gold fields, that geological processes played an important role in the religious history of gold-producing zones, so that the same geological processes that injected gold veins into quartz rock also created rocky soils and escarpments on the landscape that became dominions of ancestral religious traditions and spaces of ritual innovation. As refugees, many of them fleeing Muslim overrule, settled on Birimian rocks, intermingled, and created new religious traditions. So the question I want to pose here, and this is just an example for those of you familiar with some of the geography of the territory of Bambouk, or what becomes known as Bambouk, reaching back into some late medieval Arabic manuscripts, aligns kind of precisely with a geological formation that's been identified as the Kedugu Kenyaba in Lear. And it's a Birimian rock formation, just to give you a sense of how tightly bound these spaces are. So what else might we see in the West African past if we think with and through the underground? So we know the continent is home to diverse regional traditions of mining and well digging that have rendered the subsoil knowable, calculable, and subject to competing use rights for centuries prior to colonial rule. Do geological formations or aquifers generate a material platform for the exchange of sacred engagements with the earth, or even for the creation of certain kinds of political networks in addition to economic ones? So I'm now going to show you a series of photographs from 2 different archives. One is from IFON, based in Dakar, that has a very large collection of photographs that were taken by colonial era French geologists, and then turned back to some of the paper archives from La Bibliothèque to sort of brainstorm about some of the histories that might be found in these archives that have much yet, I believe, to tell us about the subregion. So here are 2 images associated with copper prospecting conducted in Mauritania in 1953. So on one hand, we see here on your right, a French geologist overseeing the work of Mauritanian assistants as they're classifying geological samples. Now, these were for copper. But in the same collection of photographs, which importantly do not have any documentation with them, so it's uniquely the photographs that have remained, we see images of the entrance of the Serpent Cave, suggesting the engagement of this same geological team with a sacred landscape, perhaps one tied to the historic movements of Bida or Nininkala, or perhaps other regional serpent spirits. This is an image from the salt fields of Niger in the same year as the copper prospection in Mauritania. So this photograph was intriguingly taken by Raymond Moni, who is a very kind of famous colonial era archaeologist who conducted a lot of research in the Sahara, so Niger, Mauritania, and in Senegal as well. So again, we don't have any sort of paper documentation for this beyond just the information about the photograph itself. But again, it's sort of suggestive of and gives us a sense of how active these salt fields were even late into the colonial period, and are also suggestive of a lot of different relationships that might have unfolded between the assistants and the guides that led these geologists across this landscape. Another sort of theme that emerges in these photographs, most strikingly because they're drawn from across this enormous federal territory. So you can be looking at a photograph of a salt field in Niger and right alongside one in, this was in Rufisque in Senegal. We see a lot of photos of women's gendered work on the salt fields. And while important work on this has been done, I would suggest that there's much more that could be said and interrogated about the sort of gendered diasporas of techniques and craftsmanship around salt that have evolved and potentially spread across these salt fields across time. It's not something that I've personally looked into at depth, but I think it's calling out for further historical inquiry. So moving back to La Bibliothèque and reflecting a little bit about what are some of the political histories and legacies of these subterranean archives. Mining and geological archives occupy a precarious administrative place in the context of the Cold War in the Global South. So archives of mining ministries in West Africa as elsewhere in the decolonizing world were distinctively transnational in scope, accumulating the paper traces of pitched confrontations between decolonizing states, claiming sovereignty over natural resources, and the exertions of former imperial nations, as well as the post-war United States and the United Nations, which were seeking to expand the rule and knowledge of multinational capital and market-friendly regimes. From the perspective of much of West Africa and elsewhere in the decolonizing world that adopted programs like state socialism, these archives captured at times horizontal third worldist projects like Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, or Pan-Asianism, or developmentalist cooperation with the Soviet Union. So such archives thus map alternative visions of international order and post-colonial visions, in some cases of economic freedom, contingent on the political possibilities of mineral wealth or the hopes of what that mineral wealth might accomplish. But intriguingly, many subterranean archives not only document historical prospecting of minerals, oil, and water, and all the kind of extractive work, visual and material that went into that, but they are also sites of prospecting themselves. So many archives, of course, contain economically sensitive information, but subterranean archives are arguably unique and their potential for generating fresh wealth when read by the right set of expert eyes under new economic and political conditions. So we see this activity in the more recent history of Senegal's geological library. In the early 2000s, historic studies long shelved and forgotten in this library were rediscovered and marketed to foreign investors as prices for gold soared. So the Ministry of Mines recruited funds from the European Union to digitize geological maps from the 1950s and 70s, which they then sold to gold and iron exploration firms. Despite this massive influx of foreign capital, Senegal's Service of Geology, now the owners of these documents, seek funds from international donors today to restore and digitize the remaining collection, which for them is now largely for the purposes of kind of scientific and humanistic research, because a lot of the kind of economic value of these older archives have been subsequently replaced by new prospecting techniques. So in conclusion, just some things to think about. What might oral traditions tell us about the underground as a space of ritual engagement, expertise, and labor? Here thinking perhaps comparatively with stories of spirited serpents, among others. How do we access the underground as a historical form? And how might we preserve these oral and documentary repositories of the West African past in ways that are ethical and engaged with local institutions? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the presentation. Our fourth presenter and final presenter before our discussant is Dr. Harmony O'Rourke, a professor of history at Pitzer College. And the title of her presentation is Latent Violence and Deciphering Meaning in Cameroon's Crater Lake Disasters.
I feel like the caboose. Thank you again so much for inviting me here, Dr. Achebe. I feel very honored. I'm going to get right into it. I'm sure everybody's exhausted. In the early morning hours of August 15th, 1984, 37 people died from an unknown cause while walking near Cameroon's West Province at Lake Monoun. Officials wondered if the causes were human-made toxins, natural gases of some kind, or perhaps even a bomb. Exactly 2 years later, in 1986, and roughly 90 miles north of Monoun, the much larger Lake Nyos in the Northwest Province exploded the evening of August 21st, producing a plume of toxic gas that spilled into the surrounding valley, causing the deaths of close to 1,800 people, 5,000 head of cattle, and countless fauna down to the microscopic. It was absolutely silent. In the aftermath of the Lake Nyos explosion, narratives of revengeful spirits arose alongside suspicions similar to those at Monoun. At the same time, humanitarian workers erected refugee camps, Cameroonian military units buried the dead in mass graves, and officials debated what to do with thousands of scattered livestock carcasses. International teams of scientists also made their way to the region. They collected and analyzed evidence, wrote reports, and held a major conference at Yaoundé where they debated the eruption's cause. Okay. The disaster zone spread across a rural area of 80 kilometers and a population of just over 6,000 people. This means that nearly 30% of the population died, and another 30,500 were registered as victims eligible for relief assistance. So really nearly 90% of the population was affected in some way. One survivor, Umaru Sule, was about 24 years old at the time. He lost 30 immediate and extended family members. Everyone in his immediate family died except for his father. When he saw his father, he remembered, my father, his reaction was the world had ended. That was the way he told me face to face. I had never seen my father cry until that day. It was traumatic to everybody. And others said, we done finish. These words reflect the fundamental meaning of disaster. It is something that cannot be fully comprehended. It is totalizing, involving society, culture, and the environment. It pushes humanity to the point where no systems can withstand the collapse of cultural protections. And yet people do face the unexplainable with meaning and even a desire to manage it, if not understand it. The broad range of people involved in the Lake Nyos disaster came with myriad responses that reveal different cultural impulses in deciphering its meaning. These disasters speak to the convergence of multiple realms of knowledge, including earth and disaster sciences, spiritual beliefs, folklore, rumor, conspiracy theories, sensory perception, anxiety, and fear. This convergence occurred within unequal fields of power. For over 30 years, scientific articles and documentaries have produced the dominant global narratives about the so-called mysterious killer crater lakes of Cameroon. Many of these narratives work from binaries that position scientific methods and thought in opposition to local rumor and discourses surrounding the spiritual interplay of human and non-human worlds. In reflecting, and so this is Lake Nyos before and after the explosion. In reflecting on his first press conference in Yaoundé after the Nyos explosion, US limnologist George Kling recalled, initially with all these reports of a bomb, then similar sorts of things with Monoon, and that it was the government experimenting with different chemical weapons because it was right at the time of an attempted coup against Paul Biya. It had only been in power for a few years by that point. We wanted to make sure people understood, no, this wasn't a bomb, this was a natural event. Well, it turns out that natural event meant the natural world, which included spirits. You cannot separate those. So that reinforced the idea that the Mamiwata spirit in Nyos had come up and killed the village. Looking back, Kling acknowledges the significance of these local readings. He brings them into conversation with scientific knowledge and production, but they nonetheless remain incommensurate with science, something to respect deeply even, but then also something to set aside. On his return flight from Cameroon, Kling sat next to a Cameroonian medical doctor who had been trained in England and spoke fluent German. The doctor said to him, but isn't it possible that it was the spirit, it was the Mamiwata in the lake that caused this? This question baffled Kling as he wondered how this highly educated man could hang on to this cultural social tie to the past, this family tie, stories that they've heard. But science has never had a monopoly of knowledge about the natural world, as we all know, especially so in the context of disasters. So how can we think of this then? If anything, disasters are utterly transformative. Oh, there's George Kling. I'll go back. All right. They are transformative in their power, a fundamental fact that fits firmly within Grassfield's and broadly West African cosmology, where the property of transformation is the key to power, be it beneficial or malevolent. To examine the environmental transformative power in this cultural and political context, I've experimented with an idea the idea of latent violence to analyze the intersection of the Earth's capacity to produce toxicity or harm, the repertoire of local environmental knowledges and practices that attempted to sustain community life over generations, the capability of science to understand and explain harm from the environment, and finally, the power of modern states to withhold or unleash bureaucratic, including militaristic, attention. This frame seeks to bridge so-called spectacular catastrophic events with the project of making the Earth's toxic slow violence visible. It seeks to highlight local, national, and international entanglements of power and knowledge that work in contradictory ways to identify how and why something latent becomes active, and then also how one should respond. So to explore this in greater depth, this paper will consider various domains of knowledge at work in the context of Cameroon's lake environments, regional folklore and geomythologies, Mamiwata divination, university science, and local political knowledge about Cameroon, but also the international realm. And again, all of them grappling with the possibility of environmental harm and the kinds of power that can activate it. The grassfields are a tropical highland region situated between 800 and 1,400 meters above sea level. This elevation is caused by what is known as the Cameroon Line, a long chain of volcanoes next to the Benue Trough that includes islands in the Gulf of Guinea and mountains and high plateaus on the African mainland directly northeast all the way toward Lake Chad. Those living in or near Nyos asserted that the lake there was used for bathing, fishing, washing, and the washing of clothes. And I should note, most people living near Nyos were subsistence farmers, and about 30% were settled full-day pastoralists. Generally, but the people believed that Nyos had been a good lake, an important category in Grassfield's folklore, which classifies the region's lakes into a binary of good and bad. Stable lakes, which Nyos had been, are good lakes. They consistently provide water for people's needs. Bad lakes, on the other hand, are those that are reddish-brown in color, or those that are ephemeral, or what are known locally as transferring lakes. They're shallow and they disappear from one location and are said to reappear in another. But anthropologist Eugenia Shanklin noted how each entity in the universe has the potential for good and evil. This means that a good lake can transform into a bad lake. In fact, customarily, good entities have the capacity to do greater harm because their evil potential is normally unexpressed.
She also argued that similar explosions occurred in the past, which were then recorded in area folklore in the form of migration stories that point unmistakably to the maleficent activities of lakes and other bodies of water. She found these myths among a range of traditions, one of them originating in Kham mythology. In their wanderings long ago, the people of Kham accepted hospitality from the people of Bamising in the Ndop Plain. As their numbers grew, the Fawn of Bamisi tricked the Fawn of Kham into killing many of his own people. The Fawn of Kham hanged himself, but beforehand he told his sister not let anyone cut down his body. Instead, the Kham people should watch the area where he would die until they saw the track of a python, which they should then follow to find their new home. After the fawn died, his bodily fluids dripped down and transformed into a lake, and the maggots eating his flesh transformed into fish. The Bamisi people celebrated this new source of water and food, but soon thereafter the lake exploded, its waters rose, and then it sank into oblivion, taking most of the Bamisi people with it. The Fawn of Kham had exacted his revenge. Following this ordeal, the trail of the python appeared, and the Kham people followed it to settle in the region where they are today. In a similar vein, an ethnologist and a National Geographic reporter of Neos, Kurt Steger, just weeks following the Neos disaster, the Fawn of Bafut explained that fawns and other distinguished people are believed to live inside these lakes after death, and he himself expected to do the same. From these myths, Shanklin developed generalized themes within local knowledges and how they imbued maleficent bodies of water with significance. I'm going to skip some of that just for interest of time. But what orientation did these geomythologies and folklore provide people in reckoning with the Neos disaster with so much loss? What or whose power was latent? How did it become activated? According to information collected in the months after the eruption, many people believed that the disaster could be attributed to the lake chief who died in 1983 and whose will on dying was not respected by his immediate family, especially regarding the animal that was to be sacrificed. A second realm of knowledge at play involves the ubiquitous Mamiwata, aquatic divinity. Many Cameroonians believed her anger caused the explosion at Neos, though I haven't yet heard what factors caused her anger. But generally speaking, when I look at especially Henry John Drule's work on her, identities of Mamiwata and other aquatic deities across the Atlantic are slippery. She's a complex symbol with many resonances that feed the imagination. She can be protective, but she can also be deadly. She has a destructive potential that's ever present. Given this capacity, again, it's understandable why people might draw on the Mamiwata spirit or that idiom to make some sense of meaning in a time of catastrophic transformation. Scientific knowledge, a third system of knowledge at work here, is the next thing I want to briefly touch upon. And when it came to explaining the Neos disaster in particular, like all systems of knowledge, there were intense contestations between the scientists. And there were two prevailing scientific hypotheses. French and European volcanologists, including the famous Haroun Tazieff, believed that they were volcanic or phreatic eruptions that occur when water is heated by volcanic activity and then boils or flashes straight to steam, causing an explosion. By contrast, a different volcanologist, an Icelandic one, Haraldur Sigurdsson, along with geologists and limnologists from the United States and Japan, and Cameroonian scientists concluded that the explosions were caused by a dense stratum of water at the bottom of the lakes into which mantle-derived carbon dioxide had seeped and dissolved under pressure for many years, like CO2 in a soda bottle. Unlike lakes in more temperate climates that experience lake overturn on a seasonal basis, tropical lakes don't experience that. And so there was no way for the gas-rich layers to sort of to escape on a regular basis. And so somehow this layer was disturbed by rain or something. And basically then what happened is that the toxic gas was CO2, and all of those people and animals died from asphyxiation. And it was Sigurdsson, when he looked at Lake Monoon in '84, that was first understood what was discovered what was going on. He realized they were really dealing with a totally new beast and a hitherto unknown natural disaster. But his comments were rejected by the journal Science as an implausible theory, what he thinks by what he calls the European volcanologist mafia. But but the limnological explanation prevailed by the end of the 1980s. In the wake of these disasters, all of these knowledge is circulated during a contest of extreme loss of life and lifeways, and sort of new implementations or ideas about the environment occurred as a process, or as a consequence. For example, roughly 6 weeks after the Neos explosion, there were false alarms and fears of other explosions. People took to imprisoning themselves in their homes and drinking as much palm oil and putting it into their nostrils in a bid to save their lives. Such anxiety caused palm oil prices to rise because people stocked it in their compounds. Palm oil holds ritual and economic significance in Grassfield's culture. And as recently as June 2018, the online community newspaper in the region reported that a demand for palm oil skyrocketed when people thought a different lake, Lake Awing in Santa, had exploded. And people also used palm oil during the COVID pandemic. A second example involves funerary rites. There was a really unprecedented, here's a picture of offerings to spirits in the lake so the scientists could do their work on Lake Monoon. And here's some pictures from the sort of interfaith funeral that occurred, and the role of mass dancers, which also involves a form of transformation in themselves. I don't have pictures of this yet, but there is the photographer who took this picture came across a dancer who actually took one of the Army-issued gas masks and started dancing with it. And I sort of think of this as a technological borrowing and cultural innovation, perhaps to mock the other dancers, to mock cultural outsiders, or perhaps the Cameroonian military. Finally, people also, one more minute, had conspiracy theories. People thought Israelis had planted a bomb in the lakes, and I've come to understand the different forms of the ways that Africans, especially after the raid of Entebbe, there had been a break in relations with Israel for many years with many countries, including Cameroon. And right before the Neos disaster, Shimon Peres was actually in Cameroon trying to restore those relations. But some of the rumors also took on an anti-Semitic tone, that some people felt that Israelis had planted a bomb because they sought diamonds that were underneath it. There was also conspiracy theories about a Peace Corps volunteer planting a bomb, as it was often a place, a leisure spot for some of the Peace Corps volunteers in the area. I'm going to stop there for the most part, but I do want to just say, offer one final quote that sort of thinks about these cultural exchanges that are happening about this. And that is that the surfaces of lakes are very sort of mirror-like, and they really hold the capacity to be both boundary and reflection. When Kurt Steger spoke with a young man near Womb about the Crater Lake there, he told them, sometimes if you go at midday, the lake is gone. Only houses remain, the homes of the dead. But if you shout, suddenly the lake reappears. In contemplating this encounter, Steger recalled his last visit to another lake in the area, Lake Elum. He said, I had marveled at how mirror-like the surface appeared as I gazed down from the grassy rim. It was as though the crater were a hole in a field of grass-carpeted stone, and I could look down through the hole into an eternity of clouds and blue space. At moments like that, I think even an American blinded with science can see a lake disappear. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, and I'd like to invite our discussant, Dr. Mark Dietz, Assistant Professor of History at the American University of Cairo, with a few comments, and then we'll have the Q&A.
Thanks. I realize that I am all that stands between you and happy hour, so I'll try to be brief. Dr. Achebe, let me add the thanks of everybody here. Let me add my thanks as well for founding this journal. And it's a privilege to work with the team at JWA. I think one of the many services that we provide as historians is to provide context for the past and the present. My graduate advisor, Judith Byfield, convinced me that gender is always a part of the context of the histories we write, whether we choose to address it or not. In a similar fashion, I think these 4 excellent thought-provoking papers show that the environment is also always a part of our historical context. Asan Sar tightens the focus of our attention on the relations between land and agriculture on one hand, and the supernatural on the other, especially through the life history of Cherno Mamadou Baba Jallow, who lived from 1890 to 1996, who became an important religious and social leader in the Lower Gambia. Asan interrogates the concept of jinn inhabiting forests in this region. Jinn are spirits inhabiting certain spaces like fields or forests that can be either good or bad. When something bad happens to Lower Gambians, it has often been attributed to bad jinn. The jinn possess a causality often more powerful than other physical or environmental factors. The thing I find most fascinating is the idea of converting jinn to Islam, which converts potentially evil jinn to becoming positive, friendly, benevolent jinn. And once a forest was inhabited by these benevolent Muslim jinn, then it was ripe for conversion from forest to agricultural land. I wonder if people in the Lower Gambia see this process described by Asan as quote unquote progress or development. Is it progress or development to clear forests to make way for agricultural fields? Is it progress or development for jinn to convert to Islam from local deities or theologies? Especially if we then add the agricultural work of Talibé from the local Dara as a form of piety. I'm thinking here of Stephen Fireman's description of conceptions in Shamba of eastern Tanzania of either helping the land or harming the land. It kind of seems like that is what these mostly full-bay farmers in Asan's article are doing. In addition, I like how Asan explains and analyzes a complex, diverse web of beliefs and practices in the Lower Gambia. Is this like Walter Rodney's definition of development as human beings conquering, subjugating, and taking control of their environment? It's interesting that at one point, Asan's subjects are clearing trees, and then at another point, they are planting trees in an orchard. Again, these actions seem to go along with a philosophy or a discourse about development or progress. In the end, Asan makes it pretty clear, to me anyway, that discourses about the supernatural or metaphysical in the Lower Gambia have very natural or physical environmental consequences. Rebecca Wall's paper is an important article adding her environmental history lens to the Senegal Liberations Project database, led by Rebecca and her colleagues. In JWA issue 11.1, coming out in the spring, next spring, we will have a teaching scholar series of articles on this. I'm sure that this contribution from Rebecca will add to that project's emerging historiography. I love all the statistical climate and environmental data this project can give us, but I am equally excited about the oral histories, among other sources, that Rebecca has mentioned, because I think these oral history sources humanize the data and humanize the statistics. This allows us to tell stories about the past that place these human beings in the social and cultural contexts from which they emerged. Yet, it seems undeniable at this point that some kind of wetness index, to use Rebecca's term, was not your term, okay, a term that was in your paper somewhere, was a part of that context that shaped people's decisions and possibilities for pursuing liberation. Thus, I see Rebecca's approach to these histories as quite balanced. It seems that she avoids a certain kind of environmental determinism by matching the statistics from the data with the very human sources about how and when enslaved people made decisions about pursuing their freedom. One question I have, though, is whether Rebecca and the others involved in the SLP see any kind of change over time in these decisions, beyond the natural change of seasons that's mentioned in the paper. Has it been possible to see a change from 1856 to 1903 in terms of how many people we're talking about and from what places or backgrounds they came from, in terms of those pursuing and securing liberation? I would assume it would be possible to see this kind of change over time if it occurred, but perhaps not. Perhaps continuity over time is the real story more than change, but my bet is on change, even if we're only talking about 50 years, which may not be a long time in environmental terms. Finally, one of the things I love the most about Rebecca's paper is her disclaimer that this talk should be seen as more of a first look at possibilities than a final word. Indeed, Rebecca, like others involved in the SLP, is sounding the clarion call for other researchers to join the effort to mine the data we already have on the diminishing institution of slavery in the former French West Africa, and to get busy digging up more sources and more data on this important event in an important time period in West African history. Robin d'Avignon claims to bring the critical geography of volumetric sovereignty into conversation with archival sources and oral traditions from Mauritania, Senegal, and Guinea. To ask what the underground helps us understand about regional histories of science, pre-colonial governance, corporate power, and environmental futures in Africa. I like how Robin calls our attention to a dimension of space and the environment that we seldom think about, the underground. Robin offers a paper with two threads, one that considers the subterranean world as an archive, and one that focuses our attention on the history of aquifers in West Africa. What can aquifers tell us about the religious, ecological, and economic histories of West Africa? Robin calls us to ask, what is the earth trying to tell us? Like Harmony's paper, Robin encourages us to consider what histories, or closer to Harmony's term, perhaps what latencies, lie beneath the Earth's surface. Indeed, these two papers encourage us to think of geological sources for history. This is such a unique source base. Not many of us do this. Not many of us work on this kind of source base. More than that, Robin illuminates the historical development of a quote-unquote vertical geopolitics in West Africa. This comes as a bit of a jolt to most of us focused on what Robin calls the horizontal orientation of most theories of state and corporate power. Guilty as charged. But I like the challenge. Robin asserts that the history of how African societies have come to know the underground largely remains to be written. So a bit like Rachel, Robin sounds another clarion call for historians to join her in writing the subterranean history of West Africa. Another key idea for Robin seems to be ritual geology, which somewhat similarly to Hassan Sarr's paper, brings in the supernatural forces and influences from the subterranean world. Once again, we find positive and negative spirits driving much of what is possible and what is knowable about the way the world works underground. Finally, I like the way that Robin calls our attention to the neoliberal offensive underway in geological archives. As corporate interests have nudged out government control of these archives and replaced it with the capitalistic focus of the corporations. Can corporations be trusted to maintain the archive of the underground? More importantly, what happens to the archive when it passes from state control to private or corporate control? Robin demonstrates why this change bears watching. Harmony O'Rourke, finally, provides a fascinating tale of natural disasters in 1984 and 1986 from two lakes, Lake Monoun and Lake Nyos, and their surrounding communities and the different responses to them from states, communities, and individuals. I like the diverse sets of eyes on this and their different reactions. Local communities, the Cameroonian state, Western scientists and anthropologists, and even American Peace Corps volunteers. I like how this paper takes local perspectives and explanations seriously and places them in conversation with allegedly scientific attempts at explanation. I especially liked the comments of a Cameroonian medical doctor. This was in the paper, not in the talk, but who had been trained in England and spoke fluent German, who claimed that the lake disasters could have been the work of the water spirit Mamiwata. Harmony also shows how the Western scientific analysis changed over time, suggesting that Western science was also somewhat unstable, without a firm foundation, and was also a discourse, something that historians of science have known for a long time. This argument reminded me of what made my former graduate advisor, Sonda Green, talk about bodies of water in Ewe land between Ghana and Togo in sacred sites in the colonial encounter. Harmony posits latent violence as an explanatory concept that captures all of these discourses about maleficence and, excuse me a second. About maleficence, explosions, and decay or toxicity in the environment. Harmony makes the case that this latent violence is a more capacious tool for analyzing and explaining these incidents. Though the paper starts with the 1984 disaster at Lake Monoon, it is mostly ignored for the rest of the paper. So this made me wonder how important it was that two disasters took place nearly 2 years apart. Is there important change over time here in the 2 years? Or is the important change over time what has happened since the disasters took place? Of course, it's possible for both to be important, but I wondered how important the first one was, that first explosion. Finally, I wonder about the gendered discourses that seem to emerge in this paper, yet go rather unexamined. Was that a conscious choice, Harmony? Or am I making too much out of the femininity of the Mamiwata spirit and the masculinity of the fawns of Oku and Kijim? As a story about West African environmental history, I like how Harmony centers African voices and agency while still placing the analyses of the disasters in a wider, multicultural, and systemic analytical framework. I look forward to your responses. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for our Q&A. Thank you, Omar. Who would like to ask the first question? Okay. Thank you, Bernie, for helping with the mic.
My comments are for Harmony. You know, Harmony, I love your work. I've seen you give this presentation of this project in many different spaces, and I continue to just absolutely love it. And so I've given you sort of my thoughts already, but I was just thinking, I had spoken to you about the National Museum in Yaoundé and seen how Mamiwata is referred in different ways in Cameroon. And I just remembered when I was there in July that they have a room dedicated to the disaster. And so you might want to check it out and see how is it remembered in national memory in a museum. It's still problematic, but how is it being presented and the images that are being used? And so I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are. And also the political shifts that are happening at this time with Ahidjo in exile, Biya in power. It just made me think about Mount Boya and how it erupted in 1982 and sort of the conversations people were having about the politics at this time. And so you have the good mountain, the bad volcano, and all of that. So I wonder if there's a way to also maybe extend the analysis, not trying to say what you should write about, but I'm just thinking about this active volcano nearby that's also erupting and all the stories around it and so on. Thank you.
Thank you all for a really fascinating panel. I have a couple questions, one for Asan and one for Robin. Asan, you really emphasized that sort of this idea of Fulbe as nomadic as really prevented us from seeing these other histories. I'm curious if you think about, you mentioned, and I wrote this down because I thought it was particularly interesting, that these are tied to rural isolated communities. But then you talked about immigrants to those communities. So I'm curious, like maybe this sort of nomadic versus sedentary binary, there's also room to discuss like mobility in terms of sedentary, like, people who are sedentary move. They may not like be perpetually on the move, but they move. Whether it's, they may move every 5 years, they may move twice in their lives. So I'm just curious your thoughts about that, the role of sort of mobility and that story, especially since you talked about the movement of Jallo himself earlier in his life. And Robin, I mean, this is great. Obviously, this is work you've been doing for a long time. The book is wonderful, and I'm curious about like other ritual geologies that don't have any sort of like mining component, and just sort of I think about a couple of examples, just like a Jalan in southern Senegambia as being like ritual spaces that are often in caves, but also I think about like the story of El Hajj Omar Tal, like dying in a cave. I think the fact that he was, the story is about him dying in a cave is really significant and important. So I'm just curious, kind of to expand that story past sort of the mining world and thinking about other geology. I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Why don't we give the panelists an opportunity to respond to those first set of questions? Take it as you wish.
Thank you very much, Dave and Mark, for your questions. On the issue of progress, how do these people perceive all of these transformations? There is no doubt that the people that I've interviewed and studied here are people who are convinced and followers of the Jallo family. So they embrace these stories and they tell them in such a way that it's almost similar to miracle stories, like which are used to kind of elevate or to demonstrate the spiritual power or the of their own cleric that they're telling. So the ability to convert genes into Islam is celebrated as much as in the same way that people are brought into Islam as well. So it's seen as a positive thing. No one actually considers the broader ramifications of these, the gradual decline or disappearance of these beliefs in the power of spirits to occupy certain spaces and thereby keeping people away from those places. So with the conversion of those lands into agricultural lands, we see an intensification of agricultural activity, which also had major consequences for the environment, I argue, because many places, and you see this in the reports, that they don't link them necessarily, but from the 1940s onwards, cash cropping, and here, the economic dimension of development that you implied in your comment, it's no doubt clear. And people did not plant trees as much as they cleared trees. So you had orchards popping up here and there in the region, but the rate at which new lands were opened up for peanut cultivation was by far more than those orchards that were built. So in that sense, it's capitalism and economic expansion that people celebrating, and it coincided also with the emergence or the introduction of lorries or automobiles and mechanized agriculture, because plows were now introduced and other things. So that's it. So in terms of mobility, indeed, the immigrants that I'm referring to were the migrant farmers that were coming into the region or into these villages. Some of them from the region, but moving from community to community in search of land and landlords who can incorporate them into their families so that they can keep farming. So, but there is also another form of mobility. Villages moved around a lot. It's not uncommon to go into a community and they tell you, oh, this village have moved 7 times. We were there before and now we are here. Oh, we moved there, and then we moved there, and then so on and so forth. So there was that kind of mobility as well. And then you're right. I mean, that Jallo himself was an itinerant. He lived an itinerant life. That was the kind of life that his father also lived, as well as his grandfather. So they kept moving between the different Futas, from Futa Jalon down to Futa Toro, and then from Futa Toro to Salum to different places before they caught up with old age and then settled down in a place. But yes, there is that kind of mobility as well. Thank you.
I'll just respond to Mark's questions briefly. So with your second, we really had one question, which was, is there continuity over time? No. So there's definitely periods where there's more or less liberations occurring. Spatial is difficult to answer for a reason I alluded to. It's very rare that the birth location, so it doesn't actually record where someone left enslavement. It records like where they were born. But again, a lot of times the location is the desert or like land of the Moors or a village, which to your response maybe has changed names or moved. So it will be quite a task to reconstruct the spatial dimension. And then I wanted to quickly, thank you for bringing up this issue of humanizing, because a huge issue with digital projects on enslavement and liberation is this, I think, we don't want to like turn people into data. And I feel almost like a little chagrined because there's a quick presentation and I'm like, data, but no, that's not our approach, because everything is about the people in the records. So I'm taking this opportunity to like emphasize that this is a very big problem with these digital projects that we are trying to be very, very attentive to in a very culturally specific context. And so I won't get into it now, but for example, there's questions like, would it be responsible or not to include names in this published records? Because in many diasporic contexts, reclaiming name of ancestors who are enslaved is very important. But in many West African contexts, people don't want to put their, maybe enslaved ancestry front and center. So these are things we think about very, very deeply, and why I feel so grateful to have the opportunity to work with stakeholders from the region. Because I'm not personally like the best person equipped to navigate these moral issues, right? I just wanted to like emphasize that, because I think, again, in the context of this presentation, I would hate to give the impression that it's not at the end of the day about the individuals concerned. And it points to the limitations of the colonial archive, but to do a double, turning people into data after all of this would be a real shame. So if anyone has opinions or thoughts about that, I mean, we're very open to exploring the most ethical way to do such work. So thanks.
Sure. Okay, great. I'll respond to Dave's questions and thank you for those. So the purpose for me of kind of recapitulating the argument I made in the book was more, one, I'm not like assuming everyone's read it, but to show, you know, as a foil for like what might we see, right, if we think about geological formation. So I think one of the richest areas of inquiry, in my view, is thinking about well digging and aquifers. I mean, again, going back, which operate very similarly to ore bodies. Like you could dig here for water and imagine that you'd find water 5 feet away, but in fact come up dry. I mean, and anyone that's done village level histories about their founding, et cetera, knows that much migration is often in the search of water, right? After aquifer sources go dry, and that there's a lot of practical and also religious expertise that goes into finding water and digging pits and whatnot. So that's just one idea. Even though the salt mining is mining, and there's been some important historical work on it, a lot of it's quite dated. And I think there's a lot more that could be said and done thinking about, and this goes back to sort of Jody's presentation, but thinking about craft diasporas, you know, cultures of expertise that have been cultivated across lineages and space, and understanding how those have moved and adapted with time. I mean, as in my mind, that's, yes, much of that remains to be written, you know, as sort of a project. So, and it's also sort of not an advertisement for this archive, but this is an archive that has largely been exploited. Again, this kind of goes to Mark's point, by state geologists, but also by corporations that have been privy to access to it, either directly or indirectly. And in part because that sort of economic value has been exhausted, it's now something that Senegal's Geological Service wants to valorize for other ends, you know? And so I think it's also an invitation for us to think about what might these kind of seemingly dry sort of technical correspondence and things that felt, are quite extractive in their design. What sort of data might it render for asking other kinds of questions that are more like humanistic, if you will? And I do just want to add too that some of the geological mapping in particular, which is absolutely like some of the maps in this archive, I think include some of the oldest and most detailed maps of Bambouk and Bouré going back to the late 19th century, are of villages and places that, to my knowledge, have little to no documentation in the National Archives, right? Like very remote areas, and they don't always just map a place, but write about it, its residents, talk about, specific guides and chiefs, et cetera. So it's like an incredible historical source. So not to belabor the point, but, given the particularities of our audience, I'm hopeful other people can see this, right, as a source that's important for thinking about economic, cultural, and, religious history as well.
Great. Thanks to everybody for their comments and questions, especially Mark and Jackie. So yeah, I definitely collapsed time a little bit for purposes of speaking for 15 minutes. But I think when it comes to Monoon, there is a lot less about it. It's a lot harder to find in sources. 37 people died. So when it comes to just having more details about it, it's just been harder to find. And unlike I think Robin, I'm kind of at the beginning of this. I have I've been I tried to start and then COVID happened and then a bunch of other things happened. So I'm kind of starting it up again. And a lot of these initial interviews with scientists occurred over Zoom, like during COVID, because I wanted to do something. But I would say what I do have is more of the scientific history with Monoon. A lot of people didn't really, again, know about it even too much, like throughout Cameroon, as scientists didn't really know about it. But the government, Haraldur Sigurdsson, who is Icelandic but was in the United States doing work, was asked by I think the USGS to go and investigate a few, and it wasn't seen as much of an emergency. He went there several months after Lake Monoon had exploded, and it was and he worked with a local a Cameroonian geologist. And it was there that he recognized this very strange phenomenon that he had never, ever, ever seen before. And then he brought his stuff back to his lab, and he was really worried about this. And he did think like this could destroy entire towns, which it did exactly 2 years later. But he did, like I said, he did submit that to the journal Science because he wanted it to go into a really important venue so people would be aware, and they rejected it. And he thinks it was mostly volcanologists who rejected it, who really thought it was theirs. And he actually thinks some of the volcanologists, like Harun Tazieff, who held on to this theory that it was volcanic, even with Neos, he thought that they were holding on to it like in a religious sense, actually, without really looking at the data. So, and then I also know that George Kling, so there were these other people, paleolimnologists, with headed at Duke University with Dan Livingstone. His name was Dan Livingstone. And he was a paleolimnologist. And he and his graduate students, both of whom were Kurt Steger and George Kling, were going to a lot of these crater lakes, not Monoon or Neos, and actually doing a lot of sediment coring to learn about sort of earlier time histories there, which I could go into later. So they had so there was knowledge being built up about these lakes, but, and George Kling actually sampled the waters of Lake Neos, but he was doing it for something else and didn't go down far enough to where the waters were saturated with carbon dioxide. So that part of it, I haven't been able to look at Dan Livingstone's papers yet. He died a few years ago, but I'm hoping to get there soon. I have looked at Haraldur Sigurdsson's papers in Iceland. So there's a lot to do there with Monoon especially. So thank you for asking that. Gender, I wasn't able to say this in the presentation, but something I noticed and my students noticed when we looked at this was that when there were survivor accounts, especially in the Smithsonian Magazine or different scientific journalism, it was usually men who were speaking. And sometimes that has to do with who people are, who think people who have knowledge, right? Who outsiders think have knowledge, but it also might be, who then even locally is comfortable with speaking to people. But one thing we were wondering is, did more women, die than men perhaps because of, local, migration patterns for work and things like that. And amongst sort of the young, I will say of the survivors, and I have to thank Paul Njoji Nkui, a great Cameroonian historian who did work at all of the places, social scientific work about 6 months after. It was amazing. And that report is a lifeline for me. I think 55% of the surviving population were under the age of 20. And then, but the gender was mostly similar. But for people ages 45 and older, there were 208 male survivors and only like 98 women survivors. So again, that likely is like who is there in the rural areas more consistently, probably. But in terms of the narratives then that have been captured, it's mainly been men. But some people, especially Cameroonian writers, have been working in this. There are a lot of afterlives of Neos, I would say. Bole Butake did a play about it, and here in that one, he actually blames Afan for sort of leaving traditional rites because he's more Christian, and he actually, in his, favors Fulani because, they take care of his cattle, and that's one of the reasons this lake explosion happens. But Juliana Makuchin Fatmenyi, who's wonderful, and she wrote a great short story called Woman of the Lake, where she does try to talk a bit more about a potential sort of gendered reading about an angry female lake. Whether or not the lakes are gendered, Eugenia Shanklin did find some Fulani people maybe gendered some lakes male and some lakes female, but that was she couldn't say much more than that. But that's a really important question, and I thank you for that. And then Jackie's question, yes, there are different words, and you and I had this WhatsApp conversation when you were in Cameroon this summer, but I think, yeah, one of the things I did look up, it's been hard to find it right, and it's been hard to do research. I haven't been able to go to Bamenda because things have not been stable for so very long. It's really hard, which we really haven't talked about in this room in terms of West Africa and research and accessibility, and which is very different from when I think a lot of us started. What's her name? A couple of anthropologists who work more sort of in the littoral region, their sense was that sometimes Mamiwata was more of a slang, but that it was actually the local water spirits that were specific, that were more foundational to people's understanding. And I'm wondering if that's the case a bit here too. But there is an overlap there, but it's something that needs to be looked at because people are using the language, including in these cross-cultural encounters, which is where Mamiwata all began anyway, right? Over its several 100-year history. Yeah. Exactly. So that has to be really explored. And then in terms of, should I keep this a lake project or a volcanic, bigger Cameroon line project? I'm going to stick with the lakes because I think scientifically, it was kind of historically unprecedented for Cameroonian people experiencing it. It was unprecedented. There was something about people who were just cooking at night. It was 9 p.m. and then just fell over and died. So, and the chickens, all of the microscopic, any little insect they're gone. And so I think there's something important about that. The region is also far more remote. And I think it also gets into, and then there's again, it has all these afterlives. There's an Israeli Canadian filmmaker who made a documentary funded by James Cameron, trying to prove certain elements of the plague and the seas and biblical things by using some of the scientific evidence from Neos to prove his points and his rereading of the potential reality of biblical events. So I think that there's just a lot of ways that people, again, are using what they perceive as potentially a blank slate of Africa, or Africa invented Africa as a dangerous place that I think are important, whereas volcanoes, which is also a really important history in Africa, but that kind of speaks to sort of a different realm of knowledge and fear, I think, that tends to be more global and comparative, whereas Africa is the only one with crater lakes, Lake Kivu being the largest one and potentially most dangerous.
All right, I think we are now out of time. Let's thank the panelists and our discussant.